human trafficking and slavery in America today. Just for context, you might have read that slavery means being forced to work by either debt or the threat of violence and being unable to leave. Human trafficking refers to the movement of people by the enslavers. Today, the enslaver no longer owns the slave because chattel slavery has been abolished worldwide. Yet the International Labor Office estimates that the profits from current slavery activities are $150 billion annually. Estimates of the number of enslaved range from 21 to 36 million people worldwide, with up to 300,000 people in the United States. Joining us today are two speakers. Our first speaker today will be Robert Beiser. He's Executive Director of Seattle Against Slavery, a coalition working to achieve a slave-free world, one city at a time. Mr. Beiser will discuss federal and Washington state efforts to deal with human trafficking and slavery. He will explain the workings of the Washington Anti-Trafficking Response Network, whose mission is to raise human trafficking awareness, to mobilize the public to better advocate survivor care, to provide legislation to combat human trafficking, and to help service providers build capacity in our state. Our second speaker today is right behind me, Robin Meyer. She's from Access Freedom, a local organization working on efforts in Whatcom County to deal with the commercial sexual exploitation of minors here in Whatcom County. Welcome. Please give your attention to these.
Thanks so much for inviting us to come and speak today. I usually start by telling folks how I got involved in this work to begin with. I have cared about different social issues, I guess, since I was a kid, was really interested in the people in my community growing up who had challenges because of their racial background or were from different ethnic groups, people who were homeless or experiencing food challenges and were hungry. And that turned into work later in my life where I was working with young adults and college students, trying to give them an opportunity to work on these issues. It can be a hard thing sometimes when you care about an issue to figure out who to connect with and how to do work. And so my job was basically to facilitate that role. And sometimes I was able to connect people here in the Northwest with groups around the world. And we had one trip that we put together to go and serve with an organization, a non-governmental organization in Thailand, who was working on economic development along the Thai-Burmese border. So I took a group of college students and young adults there, and for folks who don't know that much about how democracy has worked in Burma, and the government there calls it Myanmar, I hear people laughing already. Basically, only some of the people got to vote based on ethnic or religious groups. And then the person who won the election was put under house arrest on and off for about 20 years, and that was democracy in Burma. So not the best. The whole world frowned upon this in certain ways and said that they weren't going to buy goods made in Burma. And Burma came up with systems to use their natural resources and the workers in the country to sell things secretly that were made by Burmese folks and with Burmese resources as made in other countries. The area we were in along the Thai-Burmese border had factories that were set up just like this, things to be sold as made in Thailand. And the workers in those factories had been rounded up by soldiers from the Burmese government, and sometimes they were just told to leave their towns and villages, and sometimes their homes were burned and they were told, you have no place else to go and work in these factories. And because Burma is not afraid of much in the world, they certainly weren't afraid of a group of folks from Washington State seeing what was going on there. We got to talk to some of these workers and hear the stories about how if they didn't work fast enough, they were punched, kicked, hit with sticks, sometimes burned with cigarettes. If they couldn't work, their family members were sometimes hurt or threatened with violence. And if they tried to leave the situation, sometimes the soldiers would kill folks who didn't want to work in these factories. So the idea that slavery had been abolished in the world certainly didn't seem to be the case to me, because that threat of violence and that power over people working was alive and well. Around these factories, because these traffickers, the factory managers, and these soldiers felt very powerful, they also felt entitled to have sex when they wanted. And there were a number of brothels. And we got to talk to the girls who were in the brothels as well. And I say girls because these weren't adult women. These were 13, 14, 15-year-old girls. And they asked us questions about our lives, and we asked them about things that they were experiencing. And there was this one girl. She actually changed the course of my life professionally and personally. She was a 15-year-old Muslim girl who had been sold for sex in northern India and then in Burma and now in this border area of Thailand. And she asked me if there were places like that where I came from. And I could tell she wasn't asking just because she wanted to know as a fact. She was asking if there was some place she could go to be safe. That clearly things going on in Burma and in that border area were out of control, but where we had all come from sounded wonderful, and we had all this wealth and, justice and opportunity. And so surely if she was able to escape and those girls were able to escape, they could come to a place like this and they would be safe. And as a result, I wanted to lie to her because I wanted to make her feel safe and give her that opportunity. But she had been so honest, and I didn't feel like it was right to not tell her the truth. That I had known when I was here that there are girls just as young, 15, 14, 13 years old, being sold for sex here in Western Washington. There are people being forced through violence and threat of violence into work in construction and factories and agriculture and restaurants, even in people's homes as maids and nannies, believing that they're going to be hurt or their family members are going to be hurt or even killed if they don't do the work. And I told her the truth. And I felt horrible that not only did I have to give her that answer, but also that even as a person who had grown up caring about social justice issues, I had never done anything on the issue of human trafficking here where I live in Seattle. And so when I came back, I decided I wanted to have a different answer, and I would start trying to work on this issue of human trafficking. I would start trying to make a difference, because I shouldn't have to travel 10,000 miles just to care about someone who's in a bad situation, especially when I don't know anything about how to make stuff better in Burma or in Thailand. And here, I know lots of people, I know how things work, and I could possibly make a difference. And so when I came back, I started volunteering with an organization called Seattle Against Slavery. So Seattle Against Slavery believes in a basic idea that everyone deserves a life of safety and freedom and hope. And they began in 2010 to give people an opportunity to get involved. People like me who wanted to do something, didn't know what to do, and we wanted to make sure that trafficking could be prevented before it started, that we would engage the public on this issue, which I'm here today, so success. That we would take on time-consuming projects that honestly, when I talk to service providers, I don't know how they do all the things that they do with all the clients that they have and all the needs that the clients have. So to ask them to build a public awareness campaign or create a report or gather statistics or do research projects, Seattle Against Slavery can take that on because we're not a direct service provider, but we can be informed by the people who are in trafficking situations. And we also foster collaboration. So last year, we worked with over 45, I think it was 46 or 47 community organizations who cared about the issue of trafficking. And if any of the folks from City Club decide to get involved in this issue here or there, we will include you with our network of people who get connected. And what we find is when we bring people together who care about issues, who have different resources, very quickly successes can happen. People can be brought out of trafficking situations. Resources can be offered that people might not have known were there before. And we can prevent people from being exploited or abused so that it never has to happen in the first place. The way that we do that to a great extent, is listening to the people who are impacted by the issue of trafficking. I speak and teach a lot with students, junior high and high school students, and that has helped me understand a lot more why this is such a smart approach, because in having to explain this to them, the easiest thing that I say is, if you got a present for like Christmas or Hanukkah or your birthday, would you want someone who knows nothing about you, who doesn't even know the things that you like or what size things you would want, to pick for you what would be the best present in the world, and then you're stuck with it and you might really need it? Or would you like to have some input on that situation and maybe you'll get something that's useful? And then the students tell me stories about the sweater and slacks sets that they have hidden in the bottom of their closet to reinforce that. We're informed directly by survivors of both labor trafficking and sex trafficking, and we hear their stories. We hear the successes that have brought them to be able to tell us their stories, and we try to recreate those successes. And then the service providers who serve dozens or even hundreds of victims and survivors of trafficking tell us some of the trends that they see so that we can inform the public and have folks better know. We provide resources across the state in multiple languages, because many people who are around trafficking survivors might not speak English as their first language, and trafficking victims and survivors themselves might not speak English. And we give people an opportunity to act. So I know that Robin is going to talk a bit more about some of the incredible ways that you could get involved with this right here in Whatcom County. So that might look like meetings with elected officials for us, monthly educational events, talks in schools around King County, and we now have a new program called Trafficking Prevention for Schools. That's a 4-session program that we now are going to have over 1,000 students in King County will be going through this year, which is totally free and run by volunteers and facilitators. And the goal, again, is preventing people from being trafficked in the first place. And then we run awareness campaigns that now, we started just trying to do things in Seattle, and then it turned into King County, and then it turned into Washington State, and now it's in 12 states. So volunteers doing stuff together, being informed by survivors, it's directly saving people's lives. And we have been almost entirely volunteer run since 2010 when we got together. So what does human trafficking look like tangibly in Washington State? I will circumvent the first question that I'm asked at almost every speaking event, which is how much of this is going on here? Like, what are the numbers? How many people? Trafficking is an intentionally hidden crime. So with our law enforcement partners, we can often make a comparison to drugs. And if you ask them, is there a heroin problem in a city or a county, they'll say yes. But if you ask them how many pounds or grams of heroin or cocaine are in that town, they'd be like, we have no idea. The way that they know is that the interventions that they make, which for us would be survivors who are actually able to get out of a trafficking situation. We know what their experiences are and how many folks have gotten services, but we really can't say, because traffickers are intentionally hiding the people they exploit and abuse, whether it's hiding them in their home or in a hotel room or in a factory or in the back of a restaurant. People are hidden from view, and it's very difficult to get a sense of how much of this is going on. That being said, in the last 2-year reporting period, the Washington Anti-Trafficking Response Network, which is a network of service providers around the state that serve survivors of both labor trafficking and sex trafficking, saw over 180 individuals who they were able to confirm by federal definitions, which is a pretty high standard. It's not sort of like this could be trafficking or maybe not. This is very clear situations of trafficking. 180 survivors just in Washington state. And those folks were from 29 different countries. And that's just in Washington state. So you can see the diversity of this issue and why it's so important that we develop resources in multiple languages. Because often, if we're talking to a group of people and wanting them to recognize trafficking situations and report on it, you might be much less likely, if you're a person who speaks English as your first language, to see a trafficking situation. But there might be people who are in a language community that is much more constrained in their access to resources and education around these issues. So for us to get the word out in those communities themselves has actually led to many more referrals, a much higher success rate in people being given resources to get out of trafficking. There was a study done in the Seattle area around youth, and even though Seattle seems like a very big city in this way, these numbers were still kind of staggering to the folks who were able to pin it down. There were 300 to 500 youth estimated that were in the system at that point receiving homeless youth care services or sexual assault services who were being commercially sexually exploited. That was sort of the most conservative estimate. And the police who work in this field immediately said it's probably double that. That's a very conservative estimate. I'll note that that's just youth who were girls, that study that was done was just people under 18 who were girls and just in commercial sex. We see survey rates with homeless youth who are boys, where boys say, if they're asked, have you ever, to have a place to stay or food or some money, ever had to trade sex for any of those things? Boys are just as likely to say yes as girls in many of the studies. So that doesn't include boys, and it doesn't include adult women, and it doesn't include adult men, and it doesn't include trans youth, and it doesn't include any labor trafficking. So the number gets really big really fast, but again, we can't put a pin on exactly what that number would be. And Seattle and Western Washington are this major entry point. I grew up in Chicago, so to me, the idea that Seattle was near Asia, kind of, yes, I understood that. But I didn't really get the math. People still tell me, like, Los Angeles is east of Lake Tahoe, and that confuses me in my mind. But things like, Washington State being so close as a port of entry for most of Asia is something that I really didn't have a sense of. And now, looking at the fact that Asian immigration into the United States surpasses Mexico and Central America, you can see how vulnerable people would be in our area on a regular basis, working in our agricultural industry, working in our construction and our manufacturing that happens in this state. So we have a tremendously powerful economy, and some parts of that economy are being driven by the exploitation of some people who are coming from other places. But that being said, we're also one of the most successful states in the country in prosecuting these cases, both labor trafficking and sex trafficking cases, which include both foreign nationals and, unfortunately to say this, people who are born and raised right here in Whatcom County. There have been several cases it's terrifying to think of the things that have happened to the survivors of trafficking in these cases, but people are being caught, and there are some emerging trends to help people be exploited less. So one of the tools that we developed with our service provider partners was an outreach campaign called No One Should Be Forced that has this basic message, because most survivors of trafficking do not consider themselves survivors of trafficking or wouldn't use those words. No one should force you into work or prostitution. You have rights regardless of your immigration status. If you or someone you know is in a situation where they're forced to work, please call for help. And then there's this resource that is staffed with 200 different languages of translators. Before we did this campaign, and I can show you the slide, there was a sense that people didn't know how to get help, that if there was a trafficking situation that came up, like for all of you, if you saw something that seemed like it might be a little bit dicey, that people didn't know what would be appropriate as resources. And for some really good reasons. I mean, if you're thinking about people who might be undocumented and you're going to call the police, your police force might focus on the fact that they're trafficking victims, or they might just decide to put them in a deportation center. That's actually one of the threats that's used by the trafficker, that you're going to get deported, and if you've borrowed money, that you'll have debt and your family will have debt. So that's a pretty scary thing, also not being allowed to re-enter the country. So this is a resource that reports directly to service providers, and people have learned that this is actually a good strategy if people need health care or a place to stay or counseling resources, that they can connect through this number. So the hotline number, 888-373-7888, it's a national call center. It's called the National Human Trafficking Resource Center Hotline. A lot of words, but it's run by the Polaris Project in Washington, D.C., and then it feeds out into local service providers around the country. So in Washington State, the Washington Anti-Trafficking Response Network, WARN, is one of the places that gets a lot of these calls in Western Washington, and other agencies around the state are also connected. Seattle Against Slavery is a partner with Polaris, and so when people call and they say that they want to volunteer, a lot of times they refer them to us. Or if they need resources, they send them to our websites. So we turn that poster into something that not just volunteers would put up in businesses and convenience stores, but the top one was put up on all of the buses in King County, so over 200 metro buses. And then the city of Seattle got a little jealous that the county was doing something and the city wasn't doing something. So the city partnered with Clear Channel on the billboards, and they put up billboard versions of these with some design work that they even collaborated with New York City on that had been shown to be effective. And then this is how it connects with the advocacy work of Seattle Against Slavery. Several legislators said, we should have these in the state rest areas. Turns out you have to pass a law to do that. And so as an advocacy organization, we worked with legislators to get that law passed. Then, because the state doesn't want to spend money on things, even when a law is passed, the law was set up so that volunteers would have to pay to hire a vendor to put permanent vandalism-resistant metal signs. Yeah, laws. They're great. But the result was, honestly, I have to credit a particular group of people. United Methodist Women, there was a church that found out about this, and evidently there are lots of Methodist churches across the state, and they decided this was going to be their thing, that they were going to fundraise on. And so it took there's some clapping, yeah. And so I now know about places like Seabold that I never knew about before, but the United Methodist Women of Seabold sent check after check after check that they were gathering at their community meetings. And now every rest area in Washington state has one of these multi-language victim outreach signs. We were the first state in the country to do it. And now we have 8 other states who have directly sent me their logos and I changed the sign, or they send me a new translation because they have a different language group. And the result is, in 2009, there were 95 calls into the hotline, and by 2013, there were over 633 from Washington State. Almost a quarter of those were direct victim referrals, which was almost 0 in 2009, and it's continued above the 500 call level in 2014 and 2015. And so it's an incredible testament to how different community members caring about this issue, whether it's legislative or service providers or people with different language capacities, can bring these services together. And the result of that has truly been, in Washington State, we're known for working on human trafficking. The other thing that happens out of that is we find so many more survivors and offer resources, even though resources are still constrained, that it's become a thing where people are like, oh my gosh, in Washington and in Seattle, there's so much human trafficking. But everywhere I go, if I ask someone, do you think that you might have some exploitation of immigrant labor here? They're like, oh yeah. And I'm like, do you have any prostitution where there might be pimps involved? Or there might be youth in prostitution? They're like, yeah, that happens too. And I'm like, so do you have much human trafficking? And they're like, no, we have almost no cases of human trafficking. And we would know because we prosecute on them. So, it's a blessing and a curse. There's a significant problem across Washington State. There are resources that are being put into it, and everywhere that a community reaches out to possible victims or survivors, trafficking is being prevented, and survivors are able to come forward. And so I think that might be a good transition point to some of the incredible work that's going on here. So if anyone wants to follow up with us and has work that they would want to connect with on a state level, my contact information is up on there, and we can talk afterwards. But now I want to turn it over to Robin from Access Freedom.
Great, thank you. All right, thank you guys for having us, and thank you for spending your Wednesday lunchtime to listen and learn about a really challenging topic, not one that everybody actually wants to know about. So I guess I just want to express my gratitude for your interest and willingness to listen to the amazing information that Robert shared. I think I would just say all of those numbers and patterns and trends that he's sharing about King County and Washington State resonate for Whatcom County as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about what we see here. So I work with a service provider in our community, and I also work with Access Freedom. So I'm wearing a couple different hats up here, and I'm going to just kind of own that and talk a little bit about how I got involved in this subject. So I am a co-founder of Access Freedom along with Anya Milton, who's here in the room. Some of you may know her. And then also the housing program manager at Northwest Youth Services. So we serve runaway and homeless youth in Whatcom and Skagit counties. So have seen this both as a community member in a community awareness capacity and also directly as a service provider in these two communities. So similarly to Robert, I was awoken to this issue through a trip to South Africa in 2009. I went over there with great intentions, right, as most people do, to go and help abroad and travel and learn and serve. And so I worked doing street outreach in Pretoria the year before the World Cup. And you may see some stuff in the news about whenever there's a big sporting event in our country, there's talk about human trafficking, there's talk about prostitution, and really that being a big draw. So the same is true, obviously, of international sporting events. So my goal there was to go and raise awareness in South Africa about human trafficking and try to prevent it. So again, naive. I'll go ahead and own that I was naive as a 25-year-old. Talking with people in a different culture about what they could do to prevent human trafficking in their communities. Very humbling experience, which I think has served me well. But I also just was able to take that approach of talking with people who lived there and who knew what was going on in their community, and talking with women and children who were being prostituted and were trying to escape that experience. And doing trainings for businesses, for hotels, doing outreach to kids, and then doing a lot of events at the soccer games, community awareness events. So my message there was, this happens everywhere. This can happen to anyone. Everybody be alert. And it was really kind of the fear tactic around it, which can be used. And I will even say sometimes can be effective. I don't think it's the most effective approach, but that was my message then, and that was my understanding then, is because what often came to mind is that human trafficking is only women, human trafficking is only folks coming from out of the country into our community. They're outsiders, whereas, like Robert was talking about, oftentimes it's people born and raised in our community, and it's very much equally boys and girls being exploited. So I came home 2010 and said, well, if I've been talking for the last year about how this happens anywhere, it can happen to anybody in any community, in any situation, I suppose that means my beautiful Bellingham also, which was really hard. I was a student here. I've lived here for 12 years at this point. And so I started to ask questions of people and say, does this happen? Do you guys see this? And people sort of said, well, yeah, there's prostitution that happens on Samish Way, or there's illegal immigrants and there's labor trafficking, but there wasn't anything really happening as far as a coordinated effort to address it in our community. And so similarly to Robert, I said, well, that's not right, that I'm willing to go and do this abroad, but not in my own community where I know people and I'm connected and I want to be invested. And so efforts began to start what is now Access Freedom, and really focused on both direct outreach to young people who at that point were currently living on the streets, and community awareness efforts. So getting the community talking about this and acknowledging, hey, this actually is happening here and this is what it looks like as far as we know. So I was asked to talk about what it looks like in our community, and it looks like a lot of different things, and I'm going to focus primarily on what's called commercial sexual exploitation. So I, to be honest, don't have a lot of information or statistics on labor trafficking in our community. I would just say it absolutely happens, but I would not consider myself super knowledgeable or have expertise on that. So I'm going to focus on kind of what I feel like I do know. Sorry, I just want to make sure I represent this really well, because I think it's a very complex issue, and we all have our own lens that we're going to bring to it. And I want to challenge us as a community to say, if there's a group of young people being exploited, and if there's something to be sold, I think I'm sitting in a room of business folks, people that have some experience with business. If there is something to be sold, or in this case, someone to be sold, it means that there's a market. It means that there are buyers. And for me, that was one of the hardest things to recognize about my community, is that there's both young people who are at risk of being exploited, and there's demand. And so I think as a community, we need to hold both of those things as true and work against both of those things, that no young person deserves to be exploited, and the folks that are participating in the demand, there's needs and there's a reality there for them as well. Numbers are tough. Statistics are tough. I tend not to throw numbers around because I think unless I can really go into all the nitty-gritty of the research and the study, they're not always super helpful. What I can tell you is that every year there are hundreds of young people who apply for housing and vocational services at Northwest Youth Services alone. This means that there's a lack of basic resources, there's a lack of skills, and there's a lack of support. There are thousands of children in the school system in our community who are classified as homeless. This also would represent that families are lacking resources, families may be doubled up, and it's going to affect the trajectory of the rest of their life. There are also thousands of children involved in what we call systems of care. So whether that's the foster care system, juvenile justice, or other systems that are really intended to serve and protect young people, what the young people in those systems have experienced is a disconnection from their natural families and support systems. All of those things are the primary risk factors for somebody being exploited. So this really is a very broad issue, which I think is both a challenge and one of our greatest opportunities, that there's so many ways for people to get involved and participate in prevention. The message of this can happen anywhere to anybody at any time, and that fear tactic, to me it's one of those yes and situations. Yes, that's true. And acknowledging what those primary risk factors are, CSEC disproportionately affects young people and people in general who are already marginalized in their communities. So whether that's people of color, people living in poverty, or people who identify as LGBT. Those folks are much, much more likely to be trafficked and exploited. So yes, it can happen anywhere to anybody, and it does bridge kind of this socioeconomic gap. It's much more likely that somebody who's already at risk and lacking access and opportunity is going to be exploited. More specifically, what it looks like in our community, we have a lot of runaway and homeless youth in our community. There's a fairly active, what at Northwest Youth Services we would consider like street culture. There's something called survival sex, so youth will engage in the trade of a sexual act for a basic need, to meet a basic need such as food, shelter, transportation, communication. So those young people are being isolated, and somebody's seeing that as the prime opportunity to take advantage of them. There's a lot of internet-based exploitation. So a third party is not always necessary, that a young person has learned that this is a way they can get their need met. And I think what can happen in our mind is we can go, okay, so they're choosing it? No. There's a lot that goes into choice. And if somebody doesn't perceive that they have other viable options, is it actually a choice? And so again, we get back to that opportunity and access to alternatives. Kids are seeking connection. They're seeking to meet their basic needs if those needs have not been met in other ways. And then there's the exploiter who is very eager to take advantage of somebody who's looking for a way to meet basic needs, whether that's family connection, again, food, or shelter. There is a certain amount of gang trafficking in our community. We do have active gangs here, as well as kind of the more organized crime side of things, where you're going to have a more typical third-party trafficker, pimp, with maybe the folks we would more traditionally view as somebody being prostituted. But I think it's really across the board here, and as Robert said, it's hidden, right? It's intentionally not advertised, so it's hard to say there's this much gang exploitation, there's this much organized crime, there's this much street trafficking. We work with young people who tell us their stories every day. I would say probably about 70% of the young people we serve have been exploited. And a lot of times it starts very young, so 12, 13, and there's there's a diversity to it, right? It doesn't start out necessarily as somebody being prostituted sexually. It starts as developing a relationship of power and control. Oftentimes addiction is introduced, so addiction to meth, heroin, which is a way of controlling somebody through their addiction, and threats of violence. And so then you have 12 and 13-year-olds who are seeking basic needs, basic safety resources, and relationship, who are now being coerced into different acts. And then that cycle is perpetuated. What is needed to end this in our community, I believe, is a number of things. I've mentioned it a few times because I believe it's probably the most effective thing, is that people who are in this type of situation need to have access and opportunity for different economic strategies. There needs to be a different way to get those needs met, and there needs to be services that can address those basic needs, which includes counseling, trauma-informed services, so people that are going to recognize what this person has experienced, and that it's not as easy as just saying, okay, child, I'm going to take you out of that situation and put you in this one, and now I feel very good that I just did something good. The path is not quite that clear. It's a very windy one, but I think when people are provided with options that they actually believe they can choose without consequence, people take them. And so I think as a community, for us to continue to work together to address the demand for this, for these services, and to change at a systematic level what our response is, which requires legal advocacy, it requires application of laws, it requires a lot of training, and it requires those basic needs resources. So Whatcom County has a CSEC task force, which actually just met last Friday for the first time in a while. It was really wonderful. And on that task force, there's representatives of the judicial system. There's representatives from Bellingham Police Department, Bridget Collins, DV SAS. Access Freedom actually just awarded its first grant to Northwest Youth Services and DV SAS in collaboration. So now our community will have both a 24-hour hotline for a survivor to access advocacy, as well as just a chance to really address at a systematic level how these young people are moving through our systems and how we can do a better job of responding to what those needs are and how we can hold perpetrators accountable. There's definitely still more that needs to be done, but I think just the basic awareness and having you guys all here in a room wanting to learn about this is huge. So for those of you who are connected in those systems, I would say participate in this conversation. Ask more questions. Ask, what it looks like in your arena. For those of you who are not but are involved in communities of faith, anywhere that works with children, get to know the kids. Pay attention to the young people around you. And when there's things happening that maybe could be interpreted as that's a bad kid making a bad choice, take a look and see what need they may be trying to meet and what powers or pressures may be around them, keeping in mind the ideas of coercion and control. So thank you guys so much.
Thank you. Now we're going to start our Q&A portion of the program. I do have one question that our program committee has for you folks, which is, how can we tell when someone is a victim of human trafficking? Sort of, what are the signs?
Well, I think I touched on that a little bit. So for CSEC, commercial sexual exploitation, a lot of times it's gonna overflow into other areas. So somebody that's disconnected from their family or from their community, changes in physical appearance, running away a lot. If somebody is in a foster home or in their home of origin, that frequent running away, older partners, stories not lining up real well, a lot of misinformation will be coming out. I think, yeah.
One of the things that we've had shared with us with a lot of the survivors who work with Seattle Against Slavery is that they felt like people could tell that there was fear as part of their daily lives. That's a thing usually that just as an empathetic response, most of us can see in other people, that if there's a situation where someone is afraid or tense or something doesn't seem like they're comfortable, right? Whether that's in your nail salon or on a construction site, or you're working with a youth and you're asking them basic questions and they seem afraid to answer your questions. That fear is a thing that can be picked up on. And a lot of times that can be a number of different things in their lives. But like Robin was saying, simple outreach to try to connect with folks and help meet their needs or figure out if there are needs that need to be met can uncover whether or not it might be a trafficking situation, or honestly, it might be another type of situation where people need help, where there's an issue of hunger, or there's an issue of, abuse in the home, or there's an issue of sexual assault. I mean, there are a lot of these different things. It doesn't always have to be trafficking, which is a particular set of laws, for someone to need support from people in the community if they identify it.
Thank you. So we have a couple of folks here with microphones. Raise your hand and they'll come to you. Right here.
I think I want to address this to Robin. You've talked broadly about all these possibilities. Could you present a profile of a single individual?
Yeah, so kind of an example of a young person. I want to be careful, and so what I would probably do is combine a few stories. So let's say somebody walks through the door at our agency and says, I need housing. I've been living on the streets for a long time. And we say, okay, and they apply for services. And then maybe they're on our waiting list for a while, and then they move to Seattle, and they disappear, and they come back. Maybe there's a different name that they're using now. And maybe they look a little bit like they've been using meth, right? And they report, they're actively using regularly. Some of the other kids might say, oh yeah, that kid, they're back and forth between here and Seattle. Meanwhile, the kid probably has some charges for sitting on the sidewalk or for shoplifting, most likely. So they have a probation officer that's trying to get a hold of them. So they're moving around a lot while really being pursued by these systems, and not always with the intent to see what's actually going on for that young person. And this young person, in the meantime, we're trying to build relationships with them, and they may be doing their best to build a relationship with us, and not giving us all the information we need, right? Because there might be a third party who's moving them from here to Seattle or to Everett, and they don't actually have control of when they come and go. And then we go, oh, great, you have housing now, and then they're gone, right? And so then they're back on the streets because we couldn't serve them. And then they come back. And so there's a lot of coming and going. Is that helpful, kind of what that looks like?
How do these kids learn about services that you're offering? Where do they get that information?
Great, yeah, so we have a street outreach team. We also work with the homeless outreach team, which right over here, I'm going to shout out to Teresa and Andrea, who spread the word. Word of mouth also, we've been around since 1978. And so youth do know that it's a safe place they can come, and it's really relationship oriented. And then also just through other community awareness, we have got folks that go into the schools. There's a program called the Queer Youth Program that reaches out to the LGBT community. We have folks that go into juvenile detention. There are representatives from juvenile detention on the CSEC task force as well.
I'm sorry, just one last question. You talk about these different probation officers, the social workers. Do you ever, in your services, can you ever get these people together to talk about student X?
Yes, and that's exactly what we're trying to build more of within the task force is a team of people who can really talk specifically about one individual young person and help navigate that system and provide them an advocate along the way. Absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
I would say, just in response to that success and building that has been something that's been lacking. It's shocking that it has been, but for decades now, there have been people who have been working on this issue saying, why isn't the probation officer talking to the public defender, talking to the case manager? So just in King County, we developed a similar task force, and the result of that has been since April of 2014, 223 referrals for services out of those multidisciplinary teams is what we call them. And we were getting less than half of that in the years before that. So it's a huge opportunity when you bring folks together.
I belong to an organization that, for instance, if you spend $1, you save $5. And I wondered how funding is going for organizations like you with city, state, counties. Do you have to work really hard for that, or is it pretty forthcoming?
That's a fantastic question. So I'm just gonna be conscientious of which hat I'm wearing in this answer. So as an access, freedom, and community partner in this work, doing awareness and really, when we talk about kind of what we traditionally think is human trafficking, it's actually this is gonna sound really horrible, it's actually much easier to raise funds because I think it taps into kind of this very real and kind of right and wrong response in all of us of, we can very easily say a stepfather exploiting his 6-year-old daughter is wrong, right? Like, I don't know that anybody would say, no, I don't know, it's kind of complicated. It's fairly black and white, and so when you're asking for funding to respond to situations like that, I would say there's a response and people really, really give. So I'm going to switch to my Northwest Youth Services hat and just acknowledge when we're talking about runaway and homeless youth and the overlap between these two populations is profound. And we're talking about young people who may be exhibiting behaviors that we're not comfortable with and that there's lots of reasons for. And we're trying to provide the basic resources of shelter and vocational training and access to healthcare. It's a little bit more complicated and a little bit more challenging. I do think Whatcom County is very supportive of the service providers here, and I think that as a culture, the service providers are really collaborative and really want to work together. And so I think that's a great strength of our community. But it is a little bit harder because it's a little bit more complex.
So I would respond similarly that there's always this tension between the prevention and awareness work and the dramatic need for direct services. So there's a service provider partner who we work with, and if they are providing wraparound services for homeless youth, including housing, it's roughly $45,000 a year for services, the staff and the resources for that person. For Seattle Against Slavery and our prevention programs, we can reach 1,000 students at a cost of roughly $20 a student, and a lot of our focus is on having people not exploit other people. So a potential sex buyer could buy sex and sexually abuse for money, dozens, if not hundreds of people, if they're someone who's buying sex regularly. And so we're a really good value add and return on investment for that. And then at the same time, our service provider partner never has enough money to serve all of the youth. As Robin was saying, there's a wait list. They have the same situation where they say, we can get you counseling for now, but not housing, or we can get you housing for now, but you have to wait 4 months to get into, the education program or the job training program. And during that time, you'll have a place to live, but we don't have necessarily resources for all the other things that you're gonna need. So it's a constant challenge of limited resources. But that being said, the numbers on this in comparison to some of the other things going on in the community, it's small money compared to the big money that helps people. For us, we were an all-volunteer organization, and we still do most of our work with volunteers. And so I work with multi-million-dollar nonprofits. We are not that. And so the reach is always there when you work with organizations who have worked so lean for so long that your money does tremendous good, keeps people safe from really some of the most horrible things that can happen in our community. So I think it's a good return on investment, both on a numbers level and on a sort of emotional level.
Okay, we can move on.
I'd like to ask you to comment on a couple of things. One, with respect to that 27-year sentence you referred to, Albert Camus wrote a brilliant essay years and years ago, and he said deterrence is not a function of the severity of punishment. It's a function of the certainty of punishment. And in that connection, Have you heard about actions taken in a number of communities, specifically with respect to trafficking and prostitution, where they don't just arrest the prostitute, the trafficked victim, they arrest the person, what we call in the vulgar, the John, and they publicize that individual, and they find that actually serves as a much greater deterrent. In other words, instead of going after the supplier, you go after the demand. And I'd also like you to comment on the fact, if you're talking about slavery, that we think we've ended slavery in our country, but we're a little bit too smug. What we have done in many respects is outsource it. Much of the goods we find in our big box stores is in fact made by people who are working under slave-like circumstances, and we have to work on demand on that. Can you comment on those things, please?
Yeah, those are excellent points. I'll say in 2012, we did a study in King County of the rates of arrest and charges for people in prostitution versus buyers of commercial sex. I say buyers rather than Johns because it's what they do. It's not like an anonymous name. In one of the cities in King County, we found that the police had the resources in a 5-year period to arrest and charge 270 people for prostitution. In that same time period of 5 years, they had the resources to arrest and charge 5 people for buying sex. So, and here's anyone who's in business, a math problem for you. If you have 270 stores selling to 5 people, they're all going to go out of business. The truth is, there are thousands of people that those 270 people arrested for prostitution were being bought by, that were being rented for sex by. So there's an obvious opportunity for law enforcement to shift that. And I'm happy to say in 2015, as related to youth, there were 140 prosecutions for men trying to buy sex from children. And for the first time ever, there were 0 charges filed against youth in prostitution. Yeah. That's just the youth. There's nothing magic that happens on the day someone has an 18th birthday that somehow makes them suddenly, and there are still charges being filed for adults in prostitution. But that shift towards the people who clearly have a choice, who there is no pressure making someone buy sex and put someone else at risk. There's no pressure for someone to say, I have to make this person at risk of being trafficked and being, desperate to have sex with me, whether they with a stranger, whether they want to or not. So the people in prostitution, they may have situations of extremely constrained choice along racial lines, along lines of poverty. But the buyers could be focused on. And what we're finding is that certainty, I'm a big Camus fan myself, the idea that people are being watched when they're doing these activities is a function of the community at large. So if all of you know that people sometimes hire someone in prostitution for a bachelor party, and you've never said how horrible that idea is to celebrate a marriage by buying potentially trafficked sex, maybe bring that up the next time someone talks about a bachelor party, or a 21st birthday, or a trip to Las Vegas. I mean, it becomes a thing that's a joke because it's not seen as something that's observed by the community. That action isn't seen as negatively observed. And I'm a big student of history as well. So I'll say in the early 1900s, people proposed for the first time that child sexual abuse should be illegal because there weren't laws against it before. And there were arguments made in newspapers, and you'll see stuff that parallels it now, that if a child was being taken care of by a benefactor and they were being provided with shelter and food, that we shouldn't say that if that adult wanted to have sex with that child, that wouldn't be what's in the best interest of the child. We decided as a society that was a horrible argument. I think similarly we can say now, well, if there's someone who's in a situation of constrained choice, then someone who's buying sex from them maybe could be doing them a favor, so it's not a bad thing to do. It is an argument that holds water, and the law enforcement emphasis on this in King County has made this something that's a community statement, that we're working on a social norm. But the police won't arrest this. They arrested 140 people there, 20,000 projected buyers in King County alone. If you look at the stats in Bellingham, you say 10% of the men 90% of the men will never buy sex in their life in Whatcom County. 10% of the men will. They're driving sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation. It's still a lot of people. You can't arrest all of them. And on the second point, that holds true for my willingness to buy goods that might have trafficking in them, whether it's chocolate, that 50% of it comes from countries where there's rampant child slavery, or shrimp or seafood that's coming from Southeast Asia where there's rampant slavery in those industries. And there are pretty direct interventions. I will say, living in the Northwest, asking people to buy differently is not the challenge it is in the rest of the country, because we have organic, gluten-free, locally sourced, pasture-raised, and this is a thing that actually flies here. You know, when I'm in Houston, Texas, they have names for people who shop at stores like that, and it's not patriotic Americans, even though that's the way that I think about it as well. So yeah, it's a challenge across the board to say the way that I'm going to spend my money, I don't want it to hurt anyone else. So those are great questions.
Thank you. I think, and this might be our last question. No more questions? One more? Okay. There's one over here.
And my question is, since we're so close to Vancouver here, how big is the problem there, and how much of that comes down to Whatcom County?
You know, I appreciate that question, and it's one that actually gets asked a lot, is how much kind of cross-border, because of our specific location, how much cross-border trafficking happens. I wish I had a better answer for you. I'm actually curious what Robert would answer. I think we are a transition county, and so a lot of times people are moving through Whatcom County and not so much staying here, because we do have a stronger presence of Border Patrol also. So it's kind of that we're located in a place where it's easy to access, but my understanding is that oftentimes the movement is through towards these more urban areas. So
It's a very challenging thing to figure out, especially with foreign national populations. But the one piece of data that we do have is around exploitation of Native peoples, so Native Americans or First Nations people. I don't know if any of you have been following this story, but they've uncovered a huge number of disappearances of First Nations women in British Columbia, and we're seeing similar things being reported here on Native American reservations. To a great extent, this is because of really bad laws that we had for a long time that would not allow Bureau of Indian Affairs law enforcement to arrest and prosecute folks who were not Native, who were doing crimes against women on Native land. And so we're seeing, just like with the Black community, who have more challenges and access to resources, in the Native communities, you're seeing similarly massively disproportional levels of exploitation. And so here in Whatcom County, the Native communities are less resourced similarly, and the folks in First Nations community across the border in the same way. And so with the sexual exploitation, we're seeing that pretty consistently, is that it's impacting those communities as well.
I'm with Homeland Security Investigations here in town. And so that question, you answered it very nicely, that it's hard to tell because we are a transition community. So a lot of times the people come through feel like they're immigrating or being assisted in their immigration by somebody. But once they get here is when their passport is restricted from their access or the control begins. So, sorry, it's kind of impromptu, but a lot of times we don't know until they're inland and then restricted.
Thank you. Do we have one more question, Chuck? Okay.
You referred to a task force, a new task force, and that involves Northwest Youth Services and other groups like TVSAS, for example.
Yeah.
What's the name of it?
the Whatcom County CSEC Task Force.
CSEC.
CSEC, so the Commercial Sexual Exploitation of Children.
Ah, okay,
Yeah.
CSEC.
Yeah.
Gotcha,
Um,
thanks.
Yeah, CSEC.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and the task force has actually been around since, I think, 2011, and has kind of morphed and changed and grown as our community awareness has grown around this. And so what the season that it's in right now, and is really an exciting one, is getting people that have the authority to make systems level and policy level changes in our community are now at the table. And so building those partnerships so that we can make sure that these paths are wide open for people who are being exploited to receive appropriate services, and we can prosecute charges. And so we do have partners from the Bellingham Police Department who are participating there and really helping lead that, and DVSAS as well.
Okay, and a subsidiary question. Do you work with Northwest Youth Services? Is that?
I do,
You
yeah,
work-
so I'm the
okay.
housing program manager there.
Okay, and then I have another question. You referred to game trafficking, something like that. Oh, gang.
yeah,
tra-
yeah.
I was wondering, what the heck is
Yeah.
game trafficking?
Yeah,
Okay,
gang
thank you.
activity, absolutely.
Okay, well, that concludes our program. I wanted to present our speakers with a copy of Whatcom Places 2. And thank you again for speaking with us today.